hear my ringtone. By the way, happy fall at 7:43 this morning. No, I didn't look it up. Somebody posted it on social. Luke 21. It is good to see everybody, and if you're joining us on live stream, we're thankful that you're with us as well. Before we begin, our brother Jack Blake is going to say a prayer for us.
Thankful, Father, for our teachers. We are so blessed in this congregation to have so many good teachers. Not only in our adult class, but in the younger people's classes also. We pray, Father, for their strength, that they have the strength to present their lessons this morning, and that we as students can learn from them. We ask you, God, to go with us.
Amen. Thanks, brother. So in the context that we're looking at, where are we geographically in Luke chapter 21? In Jerusalem. What is the expectation like from Jesus' followers? How did he enter Jerusalem? He entered it humbly. How was he received? Like a king. And he comes in, and as he's teaching, we're picking up in the middle of the chapter, around verse 20 and following, in some very, I think I used the phrase, apocalyptic language on Wednesday night. And one of the warnings when we come across passages like this, and one of the things that's important for us if we're going to glean as much from it as we can, is that we let the Scripture itself set the context. Because it is exactly these types of passages, from 20 through 28 and following, where people will go crazy, making them apply to 2,000 years after it was fulfilled. Now, if you've ever heard any Last Days Madness type preachers, where it's Persia, it's Russia, it's the Middle East. Jesus talked about what's going on with Hezbollah and Hamas and all that sort of stuff. You know how fanciful it can get and how triggering it is to some people, especially when there's an earthquake. Does he mention that in here? Does he mention wars and pestilence and famine? Every time something like that comes across your CNN news ticker, doesn't mean that Luke 21 is coming to fruition. Now, there are ties back into passages like Hosea 9 and Jeremiah 51 and Deuteronomy 32, and like in question number 13, Isaiah 19, Psalm 18. There are ties back into all of this. But in the Hebrew Bible, when the prophets spoke of judgment from God, did it have reference to something that was going to jump across Jesus up and deal with Palestine in 1988 or 2024? No. No. What were the prophets primarily concerned about before, I'm giving away the answer, before Babylon and before the Babylonian captivity? What were they concerned about? What were they telling the people to do? Return to God. And you can add an or else to it, can't you? Excuse me. Now, what we see in the Hebrew Bible and there are apocalyptic places and scriptures that applied from the Babylonian captivity up until the time of Jerusalem. Daniel specifically has very apocalyptic literature and images that some people will rip out of its context and apply to 2,000 years later. And it's just bad Bible study. I don't know how to be nice about it. It's just bad Bible study to rip something out like that. And those of us who are older lived through the 70s and 80s when there was a literal last days madness amongst folks who said they believe in Jesus. Every chieftain that burped in Palestine caused some whack job to talk about, this is the sign of the end of time. Okay, Jesus is not talking about the end of time here. He sets the context for us. And the context is the destruction of Jerusalem. I'm coming, Rick. I got to get my soliloquy out of the way. Because look at verse 32. There's a lot of things here that we may not have exact pinpoint markers. But in verse 32, it says what? Somebody read that verse for me. Go ahead, Jim Kuzma. Now, what happened back in the 70s is they said this verse applies to us. It applies to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And they wrote books about everything that was supposed to happen by 1988, 1989, This is the generation. The generation is 40 years, and 40 years from Israel went back to Palestine and had their countryhood and statehood, and it's going to be in 40 years, and what? Everything's going to fly. And what happened in 1988? Did Jesus come back? Now, if there was an earthquake in 1988, I don't remember. I was alive in 1988. Steve, do you remember if there was an earthquake? Yeah, probably. It was 89. Okay. When did Mount St. Helens blow? I see. But anyway, so some great cataclysmic thing happens like that, and you go, "Wah! Jesus is coming." Well, he is. But who is Jesus talking to here? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, verse 20. He sets the context here. And it's important as Bible students that we let the Scripture set the context. This generation will not pass away until all these have been fulfilled. There are those who are hearing me now who will not die. I mean, there are other passages across the Gospels like this. This sets the context. Now, why is Jesus concerned about Jerusalem? Mark, you didn't ask me that question on chapter 21 questions. Why is Jesus concerned about Jerusalem and all of this? What has happened for the last 1,500 years when God's people, the covenant people of God, ignored and disobeyed the commandments and the prophets and the teachings? There were consequences to that, weren't there? And they were warned about that as far back as on the plains of Moab when Deuteronomy was written. Moses warned them and said, if you ignore these teachings, what will come upon you will be like what came upon Egypt. Now, was what happened in Egypt close to being fresh in the minds of the people on the plains of Moab before they crossed the Jordan River? They would have been, right? Those stories would have been prominent in their minds, even though the generation had passed away. And in some situations, it wasn't for another 1,000 years that those days of vengeance that Moses talked about would come. But now Jesus also makes a connection and says, it's happening now. It's coming on this generation. And just like everything else that Jesus said that was hard to understand, what did the people do with it? Most likely. Josh.
Another thing that indicating if we think back to his conversation with the Americans as well.
Mm-hmm.
For literally centuries, the Jews anchored their faith in Jerusalem.
Mm.
He's saying, not here, not in Jerusalem, it's going to be in your heart. And he's saying, you're going to have to let that go. It's going to be destroyed. You're going to have to let that go, and you're going to have to change your heart.
Hasn't one of mankind's greatest tendencies always been to turn an idol into something? Well, they turned Jerusalem into, well, God would never do this, right? God would never. And what did he say? Not one stone left on another. So, standing on the shoulders and in history, being able to look back at it, what Vespasian and Titus did when they finally had enough of Israel's insurrection and rebellion to Rome, they came in. And how did God destroy earlier in the Hebrew Bible times? Did he come down literally as God with a sword and go whomping and a stomping and a... He didn't, did he? He used nations. Nations like... Well, let's take a little step back into our Hebrew history. Who did God use since the covenant to try to get Israel's attention? What nations? Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Persia, Rome. I mean, we left out the Moabites. I mean, in the times of the judges, you had Midianites and Moabites, and I mean, he used all the nations around to try to get Israel to think. So the lesson for us in the, before I keep going further, what is the lesson of the fig tree? Question number 14. And by the way, this is not an agronomy lesson. What is the lesson of the fig tree? All right, let me change it up. How many of you have ever been to Alaska? A few of you? What do you know about fireweed? Did you get told maybe we just had a really good naturalist? Fireweed is that pinky purple plant that grows all over Alaska. And before there were calendars and cell phones, when the people out in the bush saw the fireweed flowers getting full, they knew at one point, we got to go to the city because we don't want to get caught out here. because we don't have a stash of lumber, we don't have a freezer full of food. And so Alaskans knew the time of year by the plants. People in Palestine looked at the fig tree and said, so why is he saying this following this idea of the destruction of Jerusalem? The signs will be obvious. When you see Jerusalem surrounded, what do you need to do? Get out. When you see all these things about to happen. Now, who listened? Christians listened. I've been told and read that no disciples were in Jerusalem when it finally went down. Now, do I know that specifically? No. But the disciples could see this coming. And when they saw it coming, they remembered the words of Jesus. They could look at Luke, because I'm kind of thinking that Luke was written before 70 AD, and they got out, or they read Matthew. This teaching was prominent. When this is about to come down, we got to get out of Dodge. Because why would Christians have stayed in Jerusalem? Because they cared about the people that were there and wanted them to be saved. And when they left, Rick, I completely forgot about you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I appreciate it. So, questions and comments into Luke 21. Keith, what you got?
I don't think you can. I think one of the reasons that people get this so wrong is, you know, remember the Bible how to reconcile. When you put this next to Matthew 24 and other things that are said in 25, and you go to Luke 21, it's more of a complete picture.
Mm-hmm.
And Scott is right. I mean, this one was something that God's people never thought that God would let fall. And they were stubborn about that. To this day, they don't think that nation is going.
And there are whole denominations that have based this idea on Israel coming back like that, right? I mean, if you ever heard of Herbert W. Armstrong and some of these, John Hagee, and I mean, there are some of these guys that just go, and here, you know, here's a public educated guy from Kentucky looking at this and look at verse 32, and I'm like, doesn't he set the context for it right there? Why have you in some fanciful science fiction kind of thing taken this and turned this into some fear fest so that we can prophesy about what's about to happen? By the way, did anything change in 88? No. Now he's over here bragging now. Yeah, still in diapers over here. Anyway. They didn't think it could change. Now, what else didn't they think could change? What was the stumbling block for Jews with the gospel? It's easy for us to look back and say, they should have seen, they should have known. They didn't think it was going away, did they? This is why later in Acts that the Jews are going to struggle with circumcision. This is why they're going to say, yeah, Gentiles can get baptized, but they still got to be circumcised, because the law was never going to change, Jeremiah. There's a day coming when I will make a new covenant. And the reason for the old covenant is not because he trashed it or he abolished it, but it was fulfilled. Josh.
Issue with human nature that we always have to contend with.
No.
Well, it's a materialist mindset that, even the best of us, we struggle with.
Oh, yeah.
They're concerned with the temple, but they're not alone. The destruction of Jerusalem under Vespasian, that wasn't the end of
No.
the Jews' attempt. Because they were
No.
angry and had to go but the Jews aren't the only ones. It wasn't 10 years ago when radical Muslims were wanting the United States to get involved in Syria, to go to the city of Aleppo, because they had a prophecy that the end of times would come when some great power would face them at Aleppo, and that would be the end of time. Because it was a place, it was something that they could put their hands on, and it's a human problem.
Yes, and how much has Jesus tried to teach us your natural bearings aren't how all this is going to work? Even to Pilate in John 18, what did he say? If my kingdom were of this world, my boys would be fighting right now. And so he says, watch yourselves. Verse 34, take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of, all those who dwell on the face of the earth, earth dwellers. How many of you remember back to Revelation, when we studied Revelation, and he was talking about those who dwell on the earth? He's not literally talking about everyone. Who dwells on the earth? People whose treasures are there. Not Christians. Oh, that's not going to happen. There's no way God would allow Jerusalem to be destroyed. And did they know history? What had happened 500 years, 600 years earlier? Keith?
No, for the life, I guess for the life of me, my discussion with two areas of people, I don't understand how you reconcile things. If it's the end, you're not going to escape it. I mean, what? If it's the end of time, there is no escape.
Mm-hmm.
But he's giving them a way of escape. So this can't be talking about that. Because in the final, we know that no one escapes.
Right. 100%. So, going all the way back to Luke 13, where the Tower of Siloam fell, and when Pilate did something horrific. What are we supposed to do with awful events? Are we supposed to prognosticate what's going to happen in the next 30 or 40 years? Is that really important? Because how many of you are going to get it right? Gene Dixon. Some of you old timers with the National Enquirer, Gene Dixon be putting all these great, or Nostradamus like he was some genius. Human nature, there's going to be upheavals. There are going to be earthquakes. There are going to be floods. There's going to be all sorts of stuff that happens like this. But the pinpointed nature of biblical prophecy is so far and exceeding better and right on the mark that we take it to heart. But what do we also learn since God has given us these fulfilled prophecies? What do we do now with stuff that looks like it's a cataclysmic event? Repent. Draw closer to God. Mike? Which is why he cried over Jerusalem. Which is why disciples stayed in Jerusalem for a while, up until these things were about to go down, because they cared about people, because they loved them, because they wanted to teach them the truth. Why does Keith and Craig and other evangelists take trips to all of these other places? Because one day we're all going to stand before the Son of Man, and the only thing that can save them is not their money, it's not a government, it's not a drug. The only thing that can save them eternally is the gospel. And Jesus is telling them about all of this. Now, will they listen? But what's he willing to do with the 90 and 9? Leave them and go searching for the one, right? Go ahead, Keith.
It isn't like he totally abandoned the 99. He had given them, and he gives us what to do in the remaining phase. For a while, he and us go out and search for the one.
Yep. Keith.
I think the other thing is, I'll give some of the so-called Christians own benefit of the doubt. There may be times when God is trying to get our attention.
Yes.
The problem is,
Can't pinpoint it.
I remember we went through all this in 9/11. I remember Pat Robertson being on, making a really good point that he's really trying to get our nation's attention. I don't know if that's a fact or not. We don't know. God does things in his own way at some time.
Mm-hmm.
But things of that nature have been happening from the beginning
Forever.
of time. And when we get in trouble, where so-called experts in our time is that they try to label things. But what I don't understand, maybe you do, is when they keep getting it wrong, why they still have credibility.
Well, Deuteronomy 13 and 18 answer that question. What happens if a prophet comes along and says something and it doesn't happen? What are you supposed to do with that prophet? Don't listen to him. But what are you supposed to do with the prophets when they do tell you the straight? And what is Jesus telling them here? Listen. If you can tell the weather, if you can tell what time of year it is, then I'm giving you some idea on how you're supposed to be living your life. And he says, watch yourselves. Now, was there a literal cloud? And don't you love this one too? That cloud looks like Jesus. The coming in the clouds means coming in authority and coming in judgment. This is an apocalyptic idea. It doesn't literally mean there's a cloud looking like Jesus that is a harbinger for something. You can tell the weather. By the way, what's that wet stuff falling out there? Any of y'all, maybe y'all know what it is. I've kind of forgotten. Anyway. Hopefully. Anyway. God coming in judgment, God coming in the clouds, God came. And it wasn't that he was happy about it. Because what begins to transpire in chapter 22 and following, how about that segue, is why he wanted us to avoid judgment. He wanted us to avoid vengeance. Because the vengeance that was enacted on Jerusalem, that historical annals like Josephus, what they tell us. And Larry and Julie were just in Rome, and they had a picture of the Arch of Titus. On that arch, there is a picture of Romans carrying the seven-pronged candlestick from the temple. Not one stone was left on another. This happened. It's already fulfilled.
I think this is why Old Testament history and Old Testament understanding is so important to us, because there is a judgment language in the Bible. I mean, it's very consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And when God lays it out, it happens just exactly all the way as you mentioned, all the way through time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's supposed to tell us something.
Hello, McFly. That's another antiquated movie reference there. Open your mind, open your eyes, let the Scriptures teach us, let the Scriptures give us the context. So, after saying all of this, how many of the disciples got this? Probably about as many as listened to the fact that in Jerusalem he was about to be betrayed, right? Why did Jesus... wrong question. What day is approaching when we get to chapter 22? Passover. Is that a big deal? It's about the biggest deal, except for the Day of Atonement, which is about 6 months later. Now, What does Luke tell Theophilus that the, yes, Craig? Oh, yeah. Even 1 million people. Right. And what is the buzz going around? Well, Romans are nervous anyway. When you get that many, what they would look at as wild-eyed fanatics, all in one place at one time, they're probably on edge. And then there's this guy who everybody's talking about who's doing all sorts of fanciful stuff and easy enough for them to dismiss because they're materially minded. This is just, somebody's just making up stories. And then he comes into town, but he's weird because they say he's a king, but he comes on riding this little donkey. Anyway. But what's that doing to the Jews? The pressure cooker's about to pop, y'all. Because there are some people trying to put the lid on it. And how are the leaders of the Jews trying to put the lid on? To kill him. Keith, we got. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you're right about Rome. They would be on edge, and Jews would use that to their advantage to accomplish what they saw as a way out.
Right.
To stop this from them going into prison.
I'm going to confess something to you about Judas. I've tried to twist it, to try to make him into some sympathetic figure. That he was just, there are TV shows and places that try to turn Judas into some sympathetic figure. And I don't know if that's right or not, but I do know what the Gospels say about him. During all this time and hearing all of these lessons, what does Judas do? He looks for a way to, what does Luke say? What does he call it? An opportunity to profit and to betray Jesus. Now, we can try to put a spin on it to make it like, well, Judas really just wanted to help Jesus out. We can do that if we want to, and maybe it was, but it doesn't look like that when you read through the Gospels, does it? I mean, the Gospel writers portray Judas as a greedy, the word of the day, materially minded Jew who was stealing. And so, how was he going to profit off of this situation? And maybe, in my most sympathetic, gracious way of thinking, maybe we could kill two birds with one stone. I can get some money and get Jesus up here, because surely the chief priest will listen. And what had Jesus said at least 3 times as he's told Theophilus? What's going to happen when he comes to Jerusalem? He's going to be betrayed. He's going to be handed over. He's going to be persecuted. He's going to die. Now, whether he's a sympathetic figure or not, I'm trending, as you can tell, I'm trending toward not this morning. What did the chief priest do with this? Well, obviously God is leading this because he would want this to happen. This is an opportunity. Mike. So why do the leaders need Judas? Why didn't they want the multitudes involved?
They didn't want an uprising. Again, they're looking up. If they can't contain the Jews, Rome will do something about that. And so their livelihood is what they're concerned about.
Because what do the elite want? To stay in power. Because as they stay in power, what do? Profit. They profit off of this. Okay, I hope this isn't racist. But in your lifetime, has there been any place that is ready and lit for a conflagration any more than Palestine? And it just keeps happening. What happened in Ferguson a few years ago was terrible, but has it happened since? If you've lived very long on this planet, how many times has Palestine been lit? So this isn't really new. This is something that's been going on. This has been a bombshell waiting to go off. And now with Passover, with Jesus here, we get to look back and look at all the prophecies in the fullness of time. This is the fullness of time. This wasn't done in a corner. This wasn't some secret thing. Well, he had some golden plates out in upstate New York somewhere that only he could read, and then they got lost again. If you know, you know. This isn't some secret thing. This is right out here in front of everything. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Don't lose that here. Jesus wasn't smiling this week. If we can feel the stress, every time I read John 14:1, it says, "Let not your heart be troubled." You got to know that the disciples are as confused as anybody else, but they're sticking with him. And sticking with him during these next 3 chapters is what we really need to do. Joel, what you got? Mm-hmm. Yep. According to the plan. Yep. That may be the sympathetic kind of a, yeah. Oh, there's great, yeah. He's, yep. Yep.
I am a little sympathetic with Judas because he was handpicked to be the villain.
There is some sympathy, but his choice is not beyond. He still had a choice like Pharaoh did. And the predetermined nature of all this sort of stuff, God is just and good and right. And there are some questions that I have, and I know you're not questioning God and all that, but the idea here, okay, long time ago.
I don't want to sympathize with him, but I don't think we ought to just jump on board and vilify it completely.
Okay.
What he did,
Okay.
but it was all part of the plan.
What I want you to be thinking about these next 3 chapters. What is the difference between Judas and the 11? The choice that they made. But by chapter 22 and chapter 23, when we get to the crucifixion, their choices up until the point of the crucifixion, are they astronomically different? I think the answer is no. I mean, I got hands all over the place. Of course, it's 42 after the hour. But But what is clear through this story about the 12? Who stands with Jesus? None of them. And in fact, we have great detail about Peter, right? And the difference, and here I'm giving away a sermon here, the difference between David and Saul and Peter and Judas are both the same. David did gross, horrible things like Saul did. What was the difference? David returned to God. And this preaches, y'all. When you talk to people who have done gross, horrible things, can God forgive them? But what is incumbent upon their action? They turn back to God and trust in His saving grace. So I'm going to go right to left. Steve, Mike, and then Keith. You got 2.5 minutes. Not you. I mean, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Mike? Okay. Well, we're gonna. Unfortunately, I wanted to get to that this morning. I don't often dabble in the Greek, but if you have a really good study Bible, in those verses where it says, Satan has demanded of you, he has demanded you. Why? Because of sin. But then that you is y'all. That you there, the first two yous are y'all. Satan wants all of you. But then the last four yous are, but Peter, I have prayed for you. You've got a job. Keith, real quick.
I think we have to be very careful to understand that this is so evident that God is in control of all of these events. One of the things that we have to remember is nowhere do we see in the Scripture that man's free will is ever not
Set aside, right. Yep.
But God knows a man's heart.
Mm-hmm.
We're not in that position.
And in that predetermined foreknowledge, what does God do? What is his single greatest thing? Salvation for humanity that will turn to Him. Do you have questions? Yeah. Do I have questions? Yeah. Do I need to know the answers? No, Job, because if he explained them to me, I wouldn't get it anyway. There are times that I have enough of a struggle just with the stuff that he's already delivered. But we'll get to the Passover, God willing, on Wednesday night. Make a little more headway. I love all the comments. Thank you all. Appreciate you.